This is my friend Chris. We have what I like to call a classic male friendship, in that we went almost exactly half our lives without seeing each other in person and still considered each other friends. This video is from the first time we hung out since 2007. He was donating his old gaming PC to the channel. It's from the Windows XP era and is the exact machine he used to bring to LAN parties back when we used to game together. That PC was literally the only gaming PC he has ever owned. He never upgraded, so when it became obsolete, that was the end of us gaming together online, and I'm a bit ashamed to say that's a big part of why we fell out of touch. Luckily for us, we can go 15 years without talking and still pick up exactly where we left off, with no hard feelings. Chris told me over the winter he picked up an RX 6800 XT, and I was stoked until I found out he had bought it because it was a good deal but didn't have a computer to put it in. This is a classic PC building mistake, buying parts piecemeal until you have everything you need. What often ends up happening is you never finish the build because by the time you finish buying everything, half the stuff you bought is now obsolete. Fast forward 6 months and I was putting together a computer that I cobbled together with some used parts from the Canadian Computer Collector computer collection. I had just picked up a used Ryzen 5 2600 that came with a B450 motherboard, 8GB of RAM, and a 512GB Samsung NVMe SSD. I was planning to mate this to a GTX Titan I had just picked up, put it in a case, then sell it to help pay the rent at our studio. Well, I posted up the PC specs on Facebook to see if any of my friends wanted to buy a computer, and to my delight, Chris messaged me asking if this PC would work with his graphics card that he's been sitting on. I mean, sure, an RX 6800 XT is a little overkill for the 6-core Ryzen 5 2600, but you could do a lot worse. Plus, with socket AM4 being such a long-lived generation, there would be room for him to upgrade the CPU down the line. Suddenly, this build went from something I was putting together to make a buck to something I was putting together to bring a friend back into my life. First thing I'm going to need is a power supply that can handle an RX 6800 XT. I used a PSU calculator online and it said we would need about 550 watts of power, but I firmly believe that you should never cut it close when it comes to powering your PC. So I picked out an 850 watt semi-modular power supply that we had in our collection. I believe it had been pulled from a really snazzy Q6600 gaming rig that Dan was given back in the early days of the channel, but we have since broken that PC down for parts. Next was memory. The CPU package I bought came with a single 8GB stick of RAM, and that wasn't going to be enough. We're on a budget here, so I went to Memory Express and picked up a matching 16GB stick of RAM that was on sale. Now we've got 24GB, which should be plenty, and dual channel, which will be important for gaming performance. I didn't have a case either, so while I was at the store, I bought this Cooler Master Q300L case since the motherboard that came with this bundle was M-ATX, so we didn't need to waste his limited living space on a full-sized ATX PC case. I did the original mock-up with a Red Devil RX 480 I had kicking around since I figured we want to get AMD drivers on here anyway, and everything worked. So, in my hubris, I said to Dan, there's a problem with this build. I haven't run into any problems, so there won't be anything interesting for the video. Well, I took the graphics card out, brought the computer home since Chris and I had plans to get together at my place, put his GPU in, and then hang out. And that's when everything went wrong. The RX 6800 XT is a massive card on a scale I wasn't prepared for. It fit in the case, barely, but then we ran into an even worse roadblock. It needs 3 PCI Express power cables. The power supply we were using only had 2 PCIe cables, and because it was semi-modular, the extra cables it would have come with have been lost to time. No big deal, I own a pile of graphics cards, so this shouldn't be a problem. I left the RX 480 at the studio, but I had just picked up a GTX Titan Black for 50 bucks, so I could just toss that in, buy the correct PSU cable off eBay, and let him use the Titan while we wait for the cable to come in. We hooked up the Titan, and that's when everything went wrong. I'm not really sure what's going on with the GTX Titan. I've looked it up, and apparently the Titans have some sort of an issue where you have to switch to integrated graphics and enable high power mode or something like that. But I don't have integrated graphics in this machine, so that's going to have to wait until I can put it into another computer with a beefy power supply and enough power cables and everything. Normally this would be indicative of a hardware failure, but I looked it up and apparently this issue might be caused by the final driver update for these cards. The fix is more complicated than you might think, so I decided to pull the Titan out and make a separate video about how to fix that problem. Get subscribed because that Titan took me on an epic journey that ruined me emotionally for an entire week, and we'll link to that video in the description as soon as it's out. Back to the Friendship Saver 6000, and we decide to call it for the evening, with the computer still at my house. Now, thanks to the titanic jank of Nvidia's broken driver, the Windows install is corrupted, and I have to get the Red Devil back from our studio. We've got the Red Devil RX 480 back in the system because we know it works. We've got him up and running, and while we wait for that third power cord to come in for the PCI Express power, and we're going to see where it goes from there. Cool. Speaking of cooling, aside from a clean Windows install, all it should need now is a few intake fans for adequate cooling, and it turns out this small form factor motherboard only has one fan header and it's already in use. We don't have any 120 or 140mm fans in our collection that run off SATA or Molex power, and all our adapters are in use. So now we've got to order some fans and wait for those to come in to make sure it has adequate cooling. Luckily, with the RX 480, I did some benchmarks and a stress test, and it doesn't seem to be thermal throttling with just one exhaust fan in the case, so I get it over to Chris, who now has, at the very least, a functional gaming PC that can play modern games while we wait for the fans and PSU cable to show up. A week later, the fans show up, and since nothing has changed in the last 20 years when it comes to installing case fans, Chris does that himself without my help. But we're still waiting for that modular PCIe cable, and I'm getting a bit nervous since the whole reason for this build was to get him using that graphics card, which cost more than the whole rest of the PC. When the power cable finally came in, I gave it to him, and a few days later I got a really concerning message from Chris. He's asking how much I'd want for the Red Devil, and my heart sinks. If his new, unused RX 6800 XT isn't working, it's almost certainly a power supply issue. He reassures me that he hasn't even tried yet, but since this card works flawlessly, he wants to have a backup. I assure him he can have it for whatever I paid for it, but that he shouldn't be buying it off me. That RX 6800 XT is still one of the best AMD graphics cards you can get, and he should be able to enjoy it while it's still top-tier hardware. Purchasing the borrowed card would likely mean a compromised experience while the 6800 loses value and slowly becomes irrelevant. He agrees. A few days go by and he puts his new card in, and it's such a tight fit, one of the cables is hitting the center fan on the card. You'd think that would be easily solved with just a little bit of tape, but it turns out that the USB 3 header has a little bit too girthy of a cable coming off it, and it's impeding the center fan of his massive new GPU. And here we are today. Finally, everything is working, basically, and silver lining, I guess, is we actually ended up going on an adventure to get here with trials and tribulations along the way. I've also heard that one of the best ways to build a friendship is trauma bonding, so we've got that going for us, which is nice. We haven't done much gaming yet as he's still building his PC game library, but we had a great session playing some free-to-play games like Fall Guys, and since he's got Game Pass, he's going to play Starfield on his own, and we're going to set aside some time to look through the library and find some good multiplayer co-op games to play together. If you've got any suggestions, drop them in the comments. But will this PC help to pay rent at the studio? Let's go through the financials. I got the motherboard, CPU, one stick of RAM, and the SSD for 200 Canadian, which is almost exactly 150 US dollars. The power supply cable cost me 10 US dollars. The case and RAM, which I bought new, cost me 95 US dollars. Corsair TX 850M power supply didn't cost me anything out of pocket, but the used ones on eBay seem to go for about 75 US dollars. So all in, we're looking at about 330 US dollars in cost, which works out to roughly 450 Canadian. He gave me 500 Canadian dollars for it, which works out to about 370 US. So I didn't make much money on this build. 50 Canadian dollars barely put a dent in the studio's rent, but I think I got something much more valuable out of the transaction. Now that I'm in my mid-30s, it's much harder to find people to game with regularly, and it'll be nice to bring an old friend back into my life to fill that gap. And you can fill the gap in your life by subscribing to our Patreon. For just $1 a month, not only do you support the channel and get your name in the credits, but we will consider you a friend of the channel, so your soul can feel slightly less empty since the whole world will know you support small content creators as they pursue their dream of sharing their tech hoarding situation with the world.